In our previous section, we left it on a cliffhanger as to what has been going on since the productivity explosion of the Green Revolution started to level off. We had mentioned that one dimension of the Green Revolution was the select breeding of important crop plants for more desirable, higher yielding varieties. Breeding is a process of selecting two organisms with desirable traits to breed together and produce offspring that inherit those desirable traits. What this means in practice is that farmers have been surveying their population of crops, maybe observing that a few individual corn plants produce larger cobs than all the others, and taking those plants and manually cross pollinating them so that the larger cob trait would become genetically entrenched in the lineage for that crop variety. And while this was a key component of the Green Revolution, the process for selective breeding has actually been going on for thousands of years and has resulted in some pretty dramatic improvements in what we would recognize as food. Before selective breeding, natural corn that existed in the year 7000 BC, which was native to Central America, was less than 2 centimeters long. That's less than 1 inch long. You would have to peel it by hammering it repeatedly with a hard object, only to yield 5 to 10 very hard kernels that would taste like a very dry raw potato. Today, thanks to selective breeding, a corn cob is 10 times the size of natural corn, with hundreds of kernels. It's easily peeled, easily cooked, easily eaten, and we can thank selective breeding for that. Similarly, take a natural peach, as it existed in 4000 BC in East Asia. Peaches were about an inch in diameter, had a waxy skin. The pit made up over a third of the volume of the fruit, which tasted earthy, sweet, sour, and slightly salty. Peaches today, of course, are much, much larger. The volume is 64 times greater than their ancestral fruit. The pit only accounts for 10% of the fruit, which has a soft skin and is sweeter with a higher sugar content. So, again, a much more pleasant and nutritional eating experience brought to you by selective breeding. We can think about these products of selective breeding as a type of genetically modified organism, or GMO. GMO is an abbreviation you might have heard of before because there tends to be a lot of controversy and attention given in the media to GMOs, and there also is a lot of misinformation and information that isn't scientifically accurate. Here we are interested only in the facts: what a GMO is, how they are created, what their benefits are, and what their drawbacks are. So, a GMO, a genetically modified organism, is simply an organism whose DNA has been genetically altered. Selective breeding was the ancient original process for genetically modifying organisms, a slow, painstaking process of people identifying which naturally occurring mutations should be preserved for the benefit of humans, and shepherding those plant species through their evolution over thousands of generations. But thousands of generations is a long time. And so in the mid 1980s, when those rapid improvements in agricultural productivity that had been brought about by the Green Revolution started to taper off, a new approach was needed. Agricultural scientists began to turn to genetic engineering to accomplish what selective breeding had been doing, but in a much more rapid and direct way. With genetic engineering, instead of waiting around for beneficial mutations to occur in crops naturally and then choosing those mutants to crossbreed, the genetic alterations are made directly to the plant's DNA. Almost always, this involves identifying a gene for a desirable trait in another plant, copying it, and transferring it into the DNA of the crop plant that you're working with. I'll give you a specific example. Golden rice. Golden rice was created with the goal of producing a more vitamin rich variety of rice. You probably know that rice is a staple food in many parts of the world: the Middle East, many parts of Africa, Asia and Southeast Asia, and South and Central America all consume lots of rice. It also happens to be the case that many countries in these parts of the world have populations that are affected by a serious vitamin A deficiency. In this map, you can see the rates of vitamin A deficiency by country, where green indicates an average healthy level of vitamin A, and then ranging down to red being clinically deficient in vitamin A, meaning it's actually considered a medical condition. And being deficient in vitamin A is a major issue because vitamin A is very important to eyesight and the development of the eye. Vitamin A deficiency leads to the clouding of the cornea, night blindness, corneal scarring, and when it's clinically severe enough, permanent blindness. Children who are vitamin A deficient are also more likely to die from measles and from diarrheal illnesses that lead to dehydration. So, needless to say, a serious health issue that a huge swath of the world is severely affected by. So, where does golden rice come in? Well, golden rice is a variety of rice that has been genetically modified to include two new genes that allow the rice plant to produce something called beta carotene. Beta carotene is a nutrient that humans must get in their diet in order to be able to synthesize vitamin A. It's the precursor for vitamin A. Beta carotene is found naturally in carrots, sweet potatoes, certain types of squash, and other vegetables and plants. As you may suspect from this list, beta carotene has a yellow orange color. And this is evident in the visual comparison between the golden rice on the left and the non GMO rice on the right. So, in the case of golden rice, scientists actually copied the gene for beta carotene out of the daffodil plant, which also produces beta carotene as a pigment for its flowers. The hope is that golden rice can be adopted in many of these countries that are plagued by vitamin A deficiency and where rice is already a dietary staple. The GMO was developed back in the year of 2000, and it has been undergoing testing since then for safety and nutritional standards. And in 2018, it was approved in both Canada and the United States. In 2019, it was approved in the Philippines. But then in 2023, the country's Supreme Court ordered that the cultivation of golden rice must be stopped after a petition was filed by citizens in the Philippines who believe that golden rice poses a health risk to people. In reality, it is just the opposite. Golden rice is poised to improve health, and the genetic modifications that have been included in this GMO are so minute. The genes come from known organisms. There are well over 30,000 genes in the DNA of rice, and two of those genes were substituted for genes from other organisms to create golden rice. Otherwise, it is genetically identical to normal rice, and there's no evidence in any health and safety trial that it has any effect other than improving beta carotene intake. Nonetheless, this idea that changing an organism's DNA somehow inherently generates health risk is a powerful one that has gripped the media in many countries, including here in the United States. We also, however, want to take a nuanced approach to understanding GMOs and realize that not all GMOs are the same and not all carry the same risks and benefits. So this is an appropriate time to turn our discussion to the most widely planted GMO in the United States, which is the Roundup Ready product line created by the agricultural company Monsanto. So, this isn't just one GMO that we're talking about, but a series of GMO crops that all have the same genetic mutation. The product line includes corn, soybeans, alfalfa, canola, cotton, and sugar beets. Roundup Ready wheat is currently under development, and the adoption of these crop varieties is pretty ubiquitous in the US. Presently, over 90% of all of the corn, soybeans, canola, cotton, and sugar beets grown in the US come from Roundup Ready product line. Alfalfa was introduced more recently, so its numbers are lower but increasing. So, why are these crops so popular? What is their benefit? The genetic modification that has been implemented in all of those plants is resistance to a weed killer called Roundup. Roundup is a product that you can buy. You may have seen it on the shelves in the hardware stores. The active ingredient in Roundup is a chemical called glyphosate. And the way that glyphosate works is that when you spray it on a plant, the glyphosate chemical enters the plant cells and disables a very important enzyme called EPSP, EPSP synthase. Without this enzyme, the plant can't properly produce proteins and therefore can't survive. So this is how the glyphosate kills the plant. Okay, so how did Monsanto make these crops resistant to Roundup? They discovered that there is a group of bacteria called agrobacteria that also has this EPSP synthase enzyme in their cells. The version seen in the bacteria is almost identical to the version seen in plants, but the version of the enzyme found in these bacteria is not susceptible to Roundup. It is naturally resistant. Glyphosate has no effect on it. So the gene for that enzyme was copied from the agrobacteria used to replace the gene for the enzyme in each of the crop plants in the product line. This means uh, a f- uh, when you're growing a field of Roundup Ready sugar beets, for instance, and weeds start to appear in the field amongst your sugar beets, you can spray the whole field with Roundup, and it will kill the weeds but leave the sugar beets unaffected. That's the value of Roundup Ready crops, GMO crops. So now that we understand the science behind these crops, we have to ask the questions: are they safe? What are the benefits? What are the consequences? To answer the first question, yes, they are safe. There was only one very small genetic modification made to these crop plants, and that genetic modification, the replacement of the plant gene for EPSP synthase with the agrobacteria gene for EPSP synthase, is a very small change and completely harmless. The crops are otherwise genetically identical to non GMO crops, so the plants themselves are really no different. Now, there's also a separate question. What about the weed killer Roundup? Because the question of whether the plant itself is safe is different from the question of whether the weed killer being used on the plant is safe. The health effects of glyphosate have been studied by numerous agencies for many years, looking to see whether it is safe for people to ingest. Because, of course, if it is being sprayed on crops, some of it, however minute, the amount makes its way into your foods. So, how safe is it to ingest? The EPA has performed animal studies to answer this question and has repeatedly confirmed that glyphosate has a very low toxicity when ingested. There was one notable study wherein mice were exposed to glyphosate over the course of 2 years at a dose of 750 milligrams of glyphosate per kilogram of body weight per day. And the researchers found there was no increase in cancer among the mice. It's important to note that this is a massive amount of glyphosate that the mice were exposed to. For a human who weighs 150 pounds, that would be like eating zero point 0.1 pound of pure glyphosate every day for 2 years, a completely implausible amount. This is far from the only study that has shown ingestion of glyphosate to be safe. There are many others, but the result of this one is quite striking. It's also important to recognize that animal trials are not the same as human trials, and that cancer is not the only health outcome we should be concerned about. But these studies do give us a good picture of glyphosate's probable low level of risk. And importantly, the toxicity of glyphosate is much lower compared to other herbicides than that used to be far more widely used, and have now been replaced by glyphosate as Roundup Ready crops have become more widely adopted. These include herbicides like atrazine, which is a known endocrine disruptor and possible teratogen, and Alacor, which is a carcinogen and cause of liver, kidney, and spleen damage. So substituting glyphosate for these older herbicides is a positive thing. In addition, if you can spray to get rid of your weeds, then that means you don't have to till the soil to do away with them, which reduces rates of a soil erosion. There has been an overall downward trend in soil erosion rates over time in the US, which is not exclusively attributable to less tilling due to GMO use, but also it's certainly a factor. And then finally, without the competition for space and resources by weeds, Roundup Ready crops produce a higher yield, leading to more abundant food at cheaper prices. But of course, we want to be nuanced in our examination of Roundup Ready crops, so it's also important to talk about the negative consequences of their widespread adoption. One of those consequences is a huge increase in the number of species of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. The number of species of weeds in which Roundup it no longer works has jumped by hundreds of percent in parts of the world that have adopted the Roundup Ready product line. Essentially, by using Roundup so widely and extensively, we are causing them to evolve adaptations that allow them to survive in the face of glyphosate exposure. If these trends continue, then we'll be in a bind with our dependence on Roundup Ready products and a herbicide that is no longer doing the job. We'll talk more about the issue of superweeds in our next section. But before we get there, there is another common GMO crop line that we need to talk about, and that is BT crops. So, whereas Roundup Ready crops have been genetically modified so that they are resistant to the herbicide Roundup, BT crops have been genetically modified to produce their own insecticides. They have been given the genes for creating insecticidal proteins that kill the insect pests that try to eat these crops. In the case of Roundup Ready crops, the new beneficial gene for glyphosate resistance was transferred over from agrobacteria. And in the case of BT crops, the gene for the insecticidal protein was also transferred from a species of bacteria, this one called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT for short. This species of bacteria is one that infects moths and butterflies, and so it naturally produces these proteins that are toxic to moths and butterflies in order to facilitate this life cycle. However, these proteins are harmless to humans and safe to consume. And a big reason why is because the proteins have to be activated by a basic, or in other words, alkaline pH environment. The stomachs of insects have a basic alkaline pH, but as you probably know, the human stomach is very acidic. Without the alkaline pH, the proteins lack any toxic effect, and furthermore, the proteins are only absorbed by receptors that are specific to the insect's stomach and not found in humans. The proteins create pores that perforate the lining of the insect's stomach and ultimately kill it, therefore preventing the pest from eating the crop. Because of these benefits, Bt crops have been adopted widely, just like Roundup Ready crops have. Corn and cotton are the most common in the United States, and both account for over 80% of the corn and cotton grown in the country. Bt soybean and Bt eggplant have also been developed, but are primarily grown in other countries. And just as has been seen with the case with Roundup Ready crops and herbicide resistant weeds, so too have insects been gaining resistance to Bt over time. The line in black here shows millions of hectares of Bt crops planted over time, and the red bars show the number of insect species resistant to Bt over the same time period. And you can see that there is a strong correlation between the two. So again, the pests are evolving adaptations to the innovations we've been using against them. So BT and Roundup Ready crops are the most popular GMOs that have been developed so far. But the research into potential genetic modifications for improving agricultural productivity is continuing on. One area of focus for future improvements is drought tolerance. As climate change takes hold, temperatures rise and rain patterns change. In this map, you can see how drought conditions are already negatively impacting agricultural yield and farmland across America. Agriculture is the single largest source of freshwater consumption globally. And so, if crops have less access to rainwater and need more irrigation water, that poses a serious strain on freshwater resources. If important crop plants could be equipped with genetic modifications that make them better able to tolerate low water conditions, this would be a huge benefit. Additional targets for future improvement include delayed ripening of fruits and vegetables, which make it easier to transport them, enhanced nutritional content, as in the case of golden rice, for example, and any modifications that lead to even higher yield as the worldwide population continues to grow and puts strain on food production.